Mark 10:45. Jesus says he came to give his life as a ransom for many. One of the most quoted verses about why Jesus died. Matthew copies it almost word for word. But Luke cuts it entirely. Not paraphrased, not softened, gone. Why would Luke remove one of the most important theological statements about Jesus' death? The answer reveals something surprising. The earliest Christians didn't agree on what the cross meant. To understand what Luke is doing, we need to look at the text side by side. Here's the evidence. Mark 10:45, Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many. Matthew 20:28, nearly identical. Now look at Luke's parallel passage in chapter 22. He tells the same story about the disciples arguing over greatness, but the ransom saying, absent. Luke knew Mark's gospel. He used it as a source. This is a deliberate editorial choice. This isn't an isolated case. Search Luke's entire gospel. You'll find nothing identifying Jesus' death as atonement for sins, no payment language, no substitution, theology. Luke knew these ideas existed in his source material. He chose not to include them. So if Luke isn't telling an atonement story, what story is he telling? Luke presents Jesus as a prophet, not just any prophet, but one standing in the tradition of Elijah and Elisha. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus explicitly connects himself to these figures, and prophets in Jewish tradition share a common fate. They speak God's truth, and God's people reject them, often violently. This prophet rejection pattern runs deep in Israel's story. The prophets warned, the people refused to listen. The prophets suffered. Luke places Jesus squarely in this tradition. The Transfiguration gives us Luke's interpretive key. Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus on the mountain. All three Gospels record this, but only Luke tells us what they discussed. The Greek word is ἔξοδος, E-X-O-D-O-S. Your English Bible probably translates it as departure. But that misses the point. Exodus evokes Moses, liberation from Egypt, deliverance through the Red Sea. Luke frames Jesus' death not as payment or transaction, but as exodus, liberation, deliverance from bondage. This prophet-martyr pattern isn't just about Jesus. Luke builds it into the entire structure of his 2-volume work. Watch the sequence across Luke and Acts. John the Baptist proclaims truth, faces rejection, dies. Jesus proclaims truth, faces rejection, dies. Stephen proclaims truth, faces rejection, dies. Paul proclaims truth, faces rejection, suffers repeatedly. 4 figures, same trajectory. This repetition isn't accidental. It's Luke's deliberate structuring principle. Stephen's death scene makes this explicit. As Stephen dies, he prays for his killer's forgiveness. Just like Jesus, he commits his spirit to the Lord. Just like Jesus. Luke wants you to see the connection. Stephen dies as Jesus died, not because Stephen's death atones for anything, but because faithful prophets who speak God's truth meet the same end. The pattern reveals the meaning. Now notice something else. Both Jesus and Paul are repeatedly declared innocent by Roman authorities. Pilate declares Jesus innocent 3 times in Luke's gospel, not once, 3 times. Roman governors acknowledge Paul's innocence throughout Acts. Even Jewish elders in Rome admit they have no evidence against him. This innocence motif carries theological weight. These aren't legal technicalities. Luke is making a point. Prophets die not for their own guilt, but for speaking truth to power. So what do we do with this? Are we supposed to pick a side? No. Here's the practical takeaway. When you read the Gospels, you're not reading one unified account. You're reading distinct theological portraits. Mark and Matthew present Jesus' death as ransom, a cosmic transaction, payment for sin. Luke presents Jesus' death as prophetic martyrdom, a righteous messenger rejected by those he came to save. Both frameworks are Christian, both are canonical, Both made it into your Bible. They're doing different theological work. Mark asks, what did Jesus' death accomplish? Answer, ransom, payment, freedom purchased. Luke asks, what does Jesus' death reveal? Answer, human rejection of God's messengers and God's faithful prophet who dies speaking truth anyway. Same event, different theological lenses. Next time you read a gospel passage, ask this question: what is this author trying to teach about Jesus? Not what do all the gospels say together? What is this particular author with this particular theological vision revealing? That question will transform how you read